Did you know that we used to have a Department of War? Geek out with me for a bit. On September 5th, 2025, President Trump signed an executive order to change the name of the Department of Defense back to the Department of War. And while this move still requires congressional approval, I wanted to explain what the Department of War was in our history and why the name was originally changed. When the United States was founded, George Washington authorized the creation of the Department of War in 1789. The Department of War existed for over 150 years, up until 1947, when President Harry Truman ordered a major restructuring of the U.S. military. Up until then, the Department of War primarily oversaw the Army, whereas the Navy, which includes the Marines, and the Air Force had their own cabinet-level departments. And because of the way things were set up, coordinating between these bodies was not exactly the most efficient. So after World War II, President Truman argued that America's military needed a more comprehensive organizational framework and a unified approach to its land, sea, and air forces, especially as we entered the Cold War and tensions with the Soviet Union escalated. Let's not forget that. So in 1949, the Department of Defense was established through law as an amendment to the National Security Act of 1947. The Army, Navy, and Air Force were then removed from the cabinet, and the Secretary of Defense was given authority and oversight over all the nation's armed forces. Now, why Truman chose to change the word itself from the Department of War to the Department of Defense has a lot to do with the trauma Americans were feeling after coming out of 2 world wars. In fact, many of the institutions created at that time, like the UN, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, they were all created to help prevent future conflicts and to set up systems that would resolve problems in a boardroom rather than through bloodshed. So as leaders and citizens around the world focused more on maintaining peace, from a military standpoint, the mindset also shifted more towards the idea of defense for security. That's why the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, which was also established around that time, was created as a defense alliance. In a 1946 press release where Truman argued for a Department of Defense, he wrote, "It means using our experience in World War II for the peace of the world." And what he meant by that was not about limiting our military operations. On the contrary, he meant harnessing all the elements of our military in new creative ways in order to fight for peace. So our global operations expanded further to include things like peacekeeping, security assistance, and counterinsurgencies, which also critically do not require congressional approval the way a declaration of war does. Now, by changing the name back to the Department of War, President Trump argued that the name change will deter enemies and highlight the military's renewed culture. Kind of a peace through strength message. So it's not about changing the mission or operational and organizational elements of the department. I mean, now that it's called the Department of War, I wouldn't take that to mean that we're going to be declaring war all over the place. No? All right, I'll put these down. Ultimately, military decisions will always be based on the policies and approaches of our leaders.